So if you're in an employment situation, it's what you get for that particular employment system and what you give to it, and then the person decides what is negative or positive as to the character of those outcomes. So notice what happens here. Remember from an early module that's based on OB Chapter 5, perception, and the whole human perception process plays an extremely powerful role on all of these elements. And incidentally, if you can remember your childhood development, or if you have children of your own, especially really young children, you get a sense of how fairness operates. This is when one of the kids, let's say, is you have two children in the family, and one wants the bicycle, but at the same time that the other party wants it. Then mom says, or dad says, no, you can have it at different times, and then they say something like, that's unfair. They are expressing an inequity response. That's the same as what we express when we get older. And adults will also say, it's not fair. They'll use that kind of terminology. Watch for that. That's evidence that inequity is operating. And when it does, it is a powerful negative force in the systems we are in. People compare a ratio, and you'll see these diagrammatically in the chapter and in these slides, a ratio of relevant outcomes to relevant inputs. Now, I put the word relevant in front of it as an adjective. I don't even like the word relevant. I normally don't use it. But in this context, it seems necessary. Again, the perceptual process is operating. You are perceiving what is relevant to this exchange relationship in both sides of it. And notice how I said that, to this exchange relationship, whichever one is under discussion and active in your life at that particular moment. So you have those exchange relationships between your employer and self, between yourself as a student and each of the classes that you are in, therefore each of the professors who are teaching those classes. Also, we can compare to similar ratios in the past or to some absolute standard of fairness. Depends on your upbringing. If you were brought up in a way that said people should all receive, and I'm not filling in the blanks deliberately, then you would use that as the comparative standard. Now here's what happens. A state of equity, and these, maybe better, I'll refer you to the page, because of the size of the type, obviously, page 175. That's you, person. Other refers to anyone else to whom you compare. And years ago, when I handed out your exam score sheets in here, I actually had you come down here and get them, if you recall. I stayed here, and you came down and got your score sheet. And I don't remember whether, if I saw two people coming, I might have turned them over because I didn't want anybody looking at anybody else's, which is illegal, actually. But in the old days, in the pit rooms, it used to be a curious reaction of students when I handed back exams that had a letter grade or a score that was obvious, handwritten by me on the exam. And early in my teaching career, I was fascinated with the way students' eyes can move from side to side without them turning their head. And it was an incredibly facile response. If I may use the two of you as the example, but there's somebody to your left, to your right, and somebody to your left. You may not compare to him, and maybe you do, but you would look possibly at the scores that the other people got. And I learned quickly that I had to fold the exams and the papers so that it was not visible immediately upon receiving it, because the reactions were visible. A smile is a behavioral reaction, or a grimace, sometimes a groan, sometimes something worse, such as some foul language. And it's all real. And when I discovered that, I changed my behavior a little bit. So here's what we're after. Perceived equity. Notice what I said. Though there is an approximately equal sign there, and it's approximately equal because of this perceptual process, people must sense that it is okay and in balance, and perceive it as in balance. And when they don't, one of two things will happen. Because we want symmetry in our analysis, so we say there can be the underpayment situation or negative inequity. Notice that the person's perception of outcomes to inputs, a ratio, is less than that same person's perception of the outcomes and inputs of other. Please make sure you grasp exactly this dynamic. Person is comparing to a comparison other. As I said, another person in the work environment or something in the past. Sometimes it can be an absolute standard of fairness, but because it's a perceptual process, it's in the hands of the person at all times, and the manager has a difficult time distorting it or changing it. Is this clear? You've done this since grade school. You just didn't have the labels, whether that's important to you now or not. Then we get the bad guy, or a different guy. And this is called positive inequity, or the overpayment situation. And I want you to react to this. This means, and I want you to react in the sense of, is this realistic? Will it ever happen in the real world out there? The person perceives his or her outcome input ratio as greater than the comparison ratio, the ratio of the comparison other. And therefore, the person concludes that I am overpaid for the kind of work that I am doing here. Excuse me. Do you think that's real? Would any of you feel overpaid? I wish I could do my next experiment with you. I can't afford it. Thinking of your job in the motorcycle shop, and I make a deal with the owner. And I say, I want you to give this guy $100,000 in salary for this year. You wouldn't feel guilty? No. Listen to him carefully.
There's a difference between feeling guilty, though, and knowing that you're overpaid.
We're suggesting that we can induce a feeling of guilt from overpayment. You don't think so?
No.
How about the rest? I want you to feel this one out.
I'm sure it's possible, but personally, I wouldn't feel guilty about being overpaid.
Like if I go to work for my grandma and she pays me like $200 for like an hour worth of work, then yeah, I'll feel guilty.
Okay, you did it. It's a beautiful example. As long as I can remember something a year from now, I won't forget the example you just gave. But in your relationship with the employer, you may say overpayment, as she is saying, but not guilt. But if you're working with your grandma and so on, you see how the perception changes. Now, the guilt feeling, I'm coming back in part to the comment that she made, the guilt feeling in most organizational situations will have a half-life of 21 nanoseconds. So you don't even notice that it's there. But there are situations in which the personal values of an individual says that I cannot accept a payment of that size, such as the $100,000. And I've not so much had that reaction from students in the regular Anderson School classes as I have had it in the executive program and some of the workshops I used to do, where people coming from certain sets of values will say, no, they could not accept being paid more than they are worth. And my mother, my late mother, was exactly that way. And it came from her religious values, I'm convinced. I never talked to her about it because I didn't understand any of this stuff. Okay. Now, the second thing that can happen, and I have this from a guy that I vividly remember, and it probably happened 25 years ago in a workshop, in which I gave this example of, if I'm picking on you just for the moment, but say, I will give you whatever it is. So the exact example I gave. He smiled, he said, I deserve it. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, I'm an only child, and I got everything I wanted, period. And he thought that's the way it's supposed to be. And so his values conditioned his response. Now what we have to find is what happens when this inequity stuff starts to kick in. Now right here is the response process laid out. And this figure is not in the text in the chapter. It's the words are, but the figure isn't. So if you'd follow with what you have in your hand. Perceived inequity sets up tension within the individual. You start to feel discomfort. Your body temperature may go up a little bit. You might even start to, with guilt, you may make some behavioral responses, a grimace or two, or use your hands, all sorts of possibilities. And then there is motivation to reduce the tension. So you want to bring the tension down, and that leads to the choice of an inequity response. And we have several. And would like you to think about these in the context of your experiences. And these are all on page 176, defined with slightly longer definitions. Change the inputs. Now, let's go with this $100,000 in the motorcycle shop. You said you would not feel guilty. But with your grandmother, you would feel guilty. Guilt, feeling guilty is the tension that I'm describing here. And this says you would change your inputs. What do you think you would do for your grandmother?
Give her her money back.
Say it again, it's not loud enough.
Give her her money back, or take her out to dinner or something.
You work harder.
There. She pays you $200 for 1 hour's work because she loves you. And maybe she has the money and all that. She knows you're young and you can use the money. She doesn't care. But if you feel guilty enough, you'll change the inputs, like work for 2 hours or 3, or do a broader range of activities. Then we can change the outcomes. Now, in the grandmother situation, you could give her back whatever you think is fair. I would suggest $150. You may disagree with me, but I'm on the outside looking in. Cognitively distort own outputs, inputs and outcomes. Grandmother gives you $200, and you are so clever cognitively, you distort it to make it look like $10. No, $20. You just drop a zero. It's quite simple. Or you say to yourself, and this is for everyone, not just the grandmother situation, you say to yourself, well, I'm really doing something more important, and therefore I deserve the result. That's what I think you were doing with $100,000 in the motorcycle shop. I'm worth it, and so on. Now, on the negative equity situation, we get withdrawal from the system. This is turnover, and it's described that way in the text. Here's what students do, and they can. It depends on what the drop period is. If you get... you have the choice of dropping a course for any reason without a grade or penalty, up to a certain date. And that sometimes is motivated by the person perceiving themselves as unfairly treated by that particular faculty member. We may not even talk to the faculty person, but if we see administratively huge drops, numbers of drops, in a course by a specific instructor, we worry about it. We want to know why, because it's abnormal.